Okay, and many of you who know me know that my expertise has nothing to do with Merton, that my expertise is in the area of Scripture. But having grown up Catholic in the 50s, I was very much immersed in Merton. And I only remember the one line of the song. And if anybody remembers the rest of the song, let me know. The nuns are a-flirting with Thomas Merton in the morning. But it went on, and I don't remember the first line. So Merton was always set up to us as the ideal. You know, if not only did he convert to Catholicism, so he made the right choice at the right time, but then he went into a monastery, so he was wholly directed towards God, and the nuns always were giving him as a model of what we should do, be good little nuns. Okay, so there's a fair amount I want to talk about, and the title of this talk was, Is Merton's Monastic Prophetic Spirituality Relevant for Non-Monks? And I put it in the declarative there, yes, it is relevant. But as he develops this prophetic spirituality, he really believes that the core vocation of a monk is prophetic spirituality. And so let's see what that's about. Now, I did give you a handout. On the one side, we have here a concept map. And I want to run through this concept map rather quickly, more to tell you where Merton got his ideas from over time, and then to spend more time on actually what he comes up with. There's a few extra on empty seats if you're without a copy. So there's one. Okay. Okay, as Mike said, that this is really based on Ephraim, and I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, Arcement, A-R-C-E-M-E-N-T. He is a Dominican, not a Dominican, he's a Benedictine, and he has just the most amazing grasp of Merton's works. This is not an easy book to read. It's short and small, but he really goes into an in-depth analysis of what Merton has said. At the same time, the author of the book is firmly grounded in contemporary biblical scholarship on the issue of prophecy. So he is able to talk about how we speak of prophets today and how Merton actually moved in that direction in the course of his time. The book does cover what he said early on and then how he matured over time to get to the point where he saw prophetic spirituality as foundational for monks. Part of what was going on around the Vatican II was a renewal of religious life. And Merton had been engaged in some discussions on the renewal of monastic life. But he's going to speak, you know, he felt that monastic life had become kind of formal and dry and sterile, that it was, the regulations on it were stifling the spirit, not enabling the spirit to breathe. But he had spent much of his time early on as a monk studying the origins of monasticism, and he proposes a kind of understanding of monasticism that captures what he thinks is the best of those founders of monasticism, and that relates to the prophetic, that relates to his what he comes to call prophetic spirituality. Now, in this book by Arcement, he is going to go through what Merton has to say about writers that he's reading, about philosophers, Kierkegaard, Marcel, on poets. He wrote on Blake early on in his life, And he got very much into later Latin American poets. He got into activists like Gandhi and Martin Luther King. He read social theorists, Marcuse, Elo. He read religious thinkers, Heschel, Macedon, etc. And of course, he read the biblical prophets in the Bible. He also was really well versed in the early church father, and in particular on the founders of monasticism. Merton was an amazingly, he did have a master's degree, etc., but he was an amazing reader, and he just read, in French and in Spanish. I mean, he was very fluent in a multitude of languages, and so he became very familiar with these writers, and he tended to write essays on them and what impressed him about them, etc. So all of these thinkers shaped Thomas Merton's prophetic consciousness, and then when you pick up Merton's journals and his letters, you begin to see a kind of deepened understanding of the role of prophetic spirituality. So before I get into prophetic spirituality itself, I do want to run through this concept map. This is a concept map. It's basically a visual outline. It's not a linear outline. The main topic is in the middle, and then the ones with the darker things are the subcategories, and then the ones that shoot off of that are the sub-subcategories. I was an art major in my college career, and I'm visually orientated, sort of thing. So now all of these things are going to play a role in his later development. So from Blake, now if you know anything about Blake, he was a rather weird guy. He was a mystic. Mystics tend to be a little out there. And he got himself in a lot of trouble because he was rather unorthodox in his mystic sort of vision. But Merton was attached to him precisely because he felt that Blake was able to see what others do not see. There should be a C at the end there. To see what others do not see. And Blake, he didn't, though he was criticized a lot, he sort of dismissed the people who criticized him. He didn't care what they were thinking. So, because he had this vision of the relationship of God to this world. And so what Merton draws from him is that the only way to really live one's life is to live in a world which is charged with the presence and the reality of God. And that's what he felt that Blake did, and he wanted to imitate. He also begins to understand, or begins to talk about what it is about poetry that is so kind of attractive or important to him. And that is that the poet writes out of his most authentic self. He thinks poets are more honest than most people. They see things in a different way, and they're willing to lay it out. And he's going to get this in part from these Latin American poets that he reads as well, and from Blake. And those of you who know Merton know that he's big on the true self, and so there's a kind of overlapping between the truth self and authenticity. And the other thing that Merton likes about poets are people who dream. They use their imagination. So the creative aura or aspect of poetry and the people who create poetry is meaningful to Merton. And of course, prophets are the ones who have visions and who use their imagination in speaking to people. Okay, the Shakers. He was real big into the Shakers. What he liked about the Shakers was the spirit of simplicity and innocence that they had. They created their furniture out of simplicity, etc. But it wasn't so much, to make money. It wasn't, I mean, they did need to make money, but it wasn't greed that motivated them. It was, the creation of something that was useful and that was beautiful. And he felt that the America of the 50s, and we could also punctuate the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now, very much concerned with making money and materialism, consumerism and stuff. And he felt that we had lost that spirit of simplicity and innocence that was at least characteristic of the Shakers. Then with the Latin American poets, again, he studies a handful of Latin American poets, and he finds he admires them for their simplicity and authenticity. And for him, a really authentic life is one that is a participation in the creative action of God. And he felt that these Latin American poets were doing that they were participating in the creative act of God. Now, poetry, he does talk about poetry. He wrote a couple essays on it, and he talks about it with some frequency. But he felt poetry itself has a prophetic quality because it uses symbolic language. In the poets you have a lot of vivid images and metaphors, the way they address the people, which is classified generally under symbolic language. But that also, poetry reveals something that is hidden, something that is the poet is going to draw your attention because he or she says things in a way that most people don't say that, or they see things in a way that most people don't see. So there's kind of a hidden beneath the surface to reality that the poet is able to grasp and give expression to. And this is very much in alignment with prophecy. Prophets see what most people don't see. They see either the seeds of destruction, which people are oblivious to, or seeds of hope when people are in despair. Poetry, he felt, focuses on the real. It sees through the superficial and dehumanizing tendencies. That prophetic poetry is both soteriological and eschatological in character. You can tell I'm an academic. Soteriology is a high-class word for salvation. And so that, poetry, by opening up new things to you, leading you to new insights, has this salvific quality to it. And eschatology, the word itself means the study of the end times, the new age, what we're moving towards. Jesus is an eschatological prophet. He's ushering in the kingdom of God, which is the eschatological age sort of thing. Now, Christianity maintains that the kingdom of God has come in Christ, so we're already beginning to live in that end times. But it's the future orientation. So poetry that is prophetic, it both offers salvation, or at least opens up that for you, and then directs you towards a future, towards a new age, a better time. So poetry carries within itself the capacity to heal, to save, to reveal a saner, more just existence for humankind. So a better future. And then Merton felt that the poet has the same mission as the prophet, and that is to bring out the hidden meaning beneath the surface of everyday life. Now, from Pasternak, Camus, and Faulkner, he felt that Pasternak exposed the dehumanizing injustices of our world, and that is, of course, what prophets are also going to do. And he felt that Pasternak had the courage to make deep sacrifices for the greater good, and that, of course, the prophet sacrifices in order to bring forth the message. from Camus. Now, doing Camus was pretty dangerous because these are existentialists. They were out there on the edge. People kept, why are you a monk dealing with these sort of out there existentialists, etc. And Merton said, well, because I get something from them. So for him, what he got from Camus was that the artist has a ministry of reconciliation. That it's not enough to simply point out the injustices, etc., point out what's wrong, that you need to have the more positive thrust and to bring in reconciliation so that we can move forward. And then he felt that Faulkner had a penetrating insight into the reality of things and at the same time point to a more life-giving way of being in the world. Now, these are really detailed in the works, etc., in the book itself. I'm just giving you sort of the summary things that he drew from it. What he liked from the existentialists is that they protested against mass society. Losing your identity in the modern world where you're all sort of, bunched together and treated not as individuals, but just as sort of ciphers or numbers in a larger group. And part of this he's protesting against communism. So the existentialists point to the value of the person, so you're not getting lost in the public void, and he's very articulate about that. They accept existence and freedom as pure gift. And again, this is freedom is going to be very important in terms of the freedom to live your life. For Merton, that would be in accordance with God's will. But the giftedness of life and existence, freedom and existence. He supports liberty against determinism and curtailment, and again, that's sort of directed against the communist, the philosophical determinism. Humans are determined, and that the government rules the communist. And then the prophet now. From his talk on the existentialists, he gets into a discussion, well, because many of the existentialists, are atheists, he was like, well, how do we as members of a church would be able to draw something good from them? And he felt that for the Christian, and he's basically addressing Catholics in this work, in the essay that it's on, but that the Catholic needs to balance freedom and loyalty to the church. So he was, if you know anything about Merton, he was always obedient to the church and always complaining about being obedient to the church. I mean, he always wanted to be doing something else, and he couldn't because the abbot kept saying no, sort of thing. So he struggles with this balance between freedom and loyalty. He said one time in one of his journals, he said, many people keep promoting this idea that I'm on the verge of leaving the church. And he says, I've never seriously thought about leaving the church for any more than 10 minutes in my life. And then he goes on and talks about that it is through the church that they have brought Christ to him, and he talks about what that means to him and how he could never separate himself off from the very sort of vehicle that has led him to Christ. It's a beautiful sort of testimony to his faith. And then, Merton was kind of struggling with a number of different things. He was involved in the civil rights movement. He was in protest against the Vietnam War, etc. But he was struggling with, how do I, as a monk, address these kinds of issues and deal with these kinds of issues? And he found the answer in Gandhi, that he resists the injustices of racism and war through nonviolence. And he felt that was the most appropriate stance that prophet would take. So nonviolence is non-cooperation with the disorder, injustice, and untruth of the world in which we live. And the other thing, and this connects with the Christian, with the Gospels, is that Gandhi himself identified with the helpless, and so the Christian is there to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, etc. So that true power is in weakness and humility. I think some people have a gross misconception of power, that it somehow means you can lord it over everybody. But, you know, Jesus says, I have come not to be served, but to serve. And when he talks to the apostles about leadership, he said, you shall not lord it over one another, but be of service. So it is that notion of being humble and poor. Okay, now just a few words about Merton before talking about this prophetic spirituality. You have any questions about any of that? Yes?
Going back to the poetry aspect of your model, do you feel that perhaps Merton might have thought that the Torah or the Bible might be poetry?
No, the prophets are poetry. You have the Song of Moses, which is a poem and stuff. So Miriam has a poem, her song, which is a poem. So it wouldn't exclude sections, but it's prophets who are poets. It's also the wisdom writers in the Old Testament who are poets. And so it's there that he kind of sees the power of poetry because of what the prophets do. Even though Moses is going to end up being called a prophet in the book of Deuteronomy, he's never called a prophet in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or anywhere else in the Bible. I mean, like in Hosea, he refers to him as a prophet. But Moses doesn't do anything that would link him in with the prophets of the Old Testament, Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. But what's going to happen in Israel is eventually they're going to decide that the only way to determine who is a true prophet is if they agree with the law of Moses. And so if you agree with the law of Moses, then Moses must be Moses gave us the law, he must be the prophet par excellence. And the problem with that, and they do it in the post-exilic world, the problem with that is that once you say that the prophet has to agree with Moses, the Mosaic law, then you don't need prophets any longer, you need teachers of the law. And that's what happens in Judaism. You get the rabbis and various interpretations of the law. It's been, in part, what we have going on, and it goes on in part in Merton, but once Christianity appropriated the prophets, Christianity made the prophets predictors of Christ. So their function was to proclaim the coming of Christ, and that the one who reads the Bible, their function is to find the hidden meanings where Christ is being predicted, which is what the early church did. The New Testament itself doesn't. I frequently have been known to say Christmas is brought to you by Isaiah, and it is, because he's the most quoted prophet in the New Testament. You can hardly hear Handel's Messiah without thinking of Jesus, sort of thing. And prepare the way of the Lord. Okay, that's Jesus. But prophets are poets. Okay, but what prophets do, we've tended to make prophets predictors of Jesus. And if they're predictors of Jesus, their job is done. And the only reason to read them is in order to find some clever way of predicting Jesus. But around the 1900s, the middle of the 1800s into the 1900s, biblical scholars began to say, hey, wait a minute. These prophets had a message to their own people, and it had nothing to do with Jesus. And they began to read Amos, who's really big on social justice issues, taking care of the poor and being just in society, not bribing people in the courtrooms to not bribe people in the court so that the court renders unjust verdicts, etc. And then Isaiah is also very much into issues of justice. Hosea and Jeremiah are more focused on the centrality of God, the worship of Yahweh and Yahweh alone, sort of thing. So you have a message that has been overlooked. And it's not at all surprising to me that the rise of issues of justice have dominated in Catholicism since, Leo the 13th's Rerum Novarum, that because biblical scholars were changing their understanding of the role of a prophet, and now we pay attention to what the prophet said, that they're just not predictors of Jesus. Now, Merton's going to understand them in both ways, and of course most Christians today would understand them, would continue to understand them as predictors of Jesus. But those who study Scripture will become acquainted with the message of the prophets, which is not Jesus is coming. The message of the prophet is you're going to go to hell in a handbasket because of the way you're acting towards the poor. I mean, it's basically the message. Except they didn't have hell back then. Okay. That comes in later.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, sure.
When you were talking about existentialists, you're talking
Yes.
about curtailment, and I don't know the definition of humanism and curtailment.
It is the placing limits on people. Okay, now it's to dictate to people how they ought to live their life, and again, in part, he's addressing communism. That you have a highly structured society that dictates what you're going to do, what kind of job you're going to have, and all that sort of stuff. Well, then the existentialists, they were challenging that, and so they didn't. The time was big on biological determinism because of Freud and that, and so are we biologically determined or not? And the existentialists are pushing against this notion that we are determined, that we're not free to make decisions, and then the ways that society curtails you, limits you, puts you in a box, dictates what you ought to be thinking. Just watch TV ads. I mean, they're selling you a bill of goods to sell you their product. And to this day, I don't understand what's wrong with gray hair. I just don't understand why we have, I'm sorry to say, because yours is dark. All right, my sisters dye their hair too, but why is bald not sexy?
It is.
Oh, Jean-Luc Picard was just as sexy as I'll get out. That's Jon Stewart. But on the edge, you got to have hair to look good. Did they ever look at Yul Brynner? I mean, my God. So we're dictated to look a certain, to buy stuff. To the point where we're willing to be injected with poison so we don't have wrinkles showing. Not a chance. I mean, I just won't do that. But we'll go to great lengths to follow a kind of social ideal or cultural ideal, not looking at the fact that it's just ridiculous. The Bible refers to the elderly as the gray-hairs. There weren't that many, but the ones they had did have gray hair. So, we have cultural standards of beauty and cultural standards of what gives us prestige and value. I have yet to know why you would fall for a guy because he has a flashy car. I just don't understand that. That doesn't say anything but that he ended up on this, spent too much on this car. But that's what they mean, is that we are, the existentialists, emerge in the 60s, and, as a child of the 60s, we were fighting against every limitation there was. The movie The Graduate was the embodiment, sort of, what we were fighting against. The hypocrisy that we saw in the adult population. You can't do drugs, but I'm going to go out and get drunk. I'm an alcoholic. It's the inconsistency and the hypocrisy that they were all rebelling against. But it was that you put on a front, you live in this kind of box, but it's not a real expression of one's who one is and what their freedom is. And for Merton, all of those accoutrements are the false self. They're all the things that are not really that important. Okay, we got a little. Let me continue on here. For Merton's 100th birthday, I gave a talk entitled "Incapable of Contentment," a phrase that I got from Merton himself. And Merton says that he is incapable of contentment. The fact that you have a monk taking a vow of stability, which means he's not going to leave that monastery, and is sort of set for life, and he writes a prayer, "Lord, I do not know where I am going." A prayer that everybody knows. They've got millions of copies of it, even at the monastery. But this knowing where he's going and not knowing where he's going at the same time. Because for all of Merton's doubts, for all of his contradictions, he was always grounded in Christ. That was his center. But for Merton, life means growth. He refused to see his life as a finished product. He was always evolving. He constantly sought deeper knowledge and understanding, and that oftentimes led him on very controversial paths. He was criticized for his pursuit of Eastern mysticism and monasticism, etc. So, as I said, he was reading atheists and everybody else too. But he was able to engage with what he was reading, and he was able to sift through it, to discern what was good, and then to apply what he learned from others in shaping his own ideas. There is a very marked difference between Merton's writings prior to that experience he had on 4th and Walnut and after that experience on 4th and Walnut. Now, I'm sure most of you are acquainted with that experience. He was on 4th and Walnut in Louisville, and all of a sudden he had the sense that he was one with humanity. He described all of humanity as shining lights, and he said if people could just see who they really are, as they are loved by God, that they won't get anything done because they'd be admiring each other. But his sense of oneness with humanity. Now, here, he's a monk, withdraws from the world, that whole notion of contemptus mundi, the contempt for the world, that the values, etc., of the world are not worth his time and energy. He is going to become a monk. Now he has an experience where he is one with all of humanity, and he no longer sees being a monk as somehow making him special. He no longer sees that. He sees his equality with all people. And it is after that 4th and Walnut experience that he's going to use the term prophet, prophecy, and prophetic far more frequently. It's there in his early writings. He has an interest in it, but the shift really changes after that. In this walnut experience, Fourth and Walnut, he moved from a kind of myopic vision of God to a universal vision of God, where the gate of heaven is everywhere. The God's presence is everywhere in this world to be found. He became a monk who was liberated from isolationism, and he moved towards dialogue and encounter. Now, if some of you read The Seven-Story Mountain, it's surprising how negative he is about Protestants. I mean, you know, it's kind of the triumphant Catholicism mentality, and that how the turning away from the world is all over the place in that. But once you get after this Fourth and Walnut experience, he's engaged with Protestant. He began ecumenical meetings at the monastery and dialogue with Protestants. And then he also began dialogue with Buddhists and Hindus, etc. So he really moved away from this kind of protection from the world to engage in dialogue and encounter with the world. And in fact, his final decade was characterized by an intense sense of responsibility and compassion for the world, which he saw as reeling under the effects of godlessness and bent towards self-destruction. Now, on that handout, on the back of that handout, I gave you a kind of a summary, and what I'm going to say now is going to follow that summary more or less, but I'm going to expand on it here. And I just wanted to give you a sort of brief outline so that if you forget all the wonderful things that I'm saying right now, you can find them on that sheet. Okay, spirituality is the way one lives their life. It's the movement of your whole being in this world is your spirituality. Spirituality is a way to God, and it involves ideas that we have about God. So how you perceive God, and then what expectations does God place upon you, and how you respond to that, how you live that, then becomes your spiritual way, your spiritual path. So spirituality is not disconnected from God. I guess you can have a kind of secular spirituality today, but for Merton, your spirituality is going to be grounded in God. But it's just not what you think, it's what you do. So it's not just withdrawal into the monastery, but it is also how you engage the world once you have experienced God. Monastic spirituality he saw as an intense, focused, disciplined way of life, completely devoted to the unification of self in and with God. So you go to the monastery to find God. But after this Fourth and Walnut experience, he's going to say, well, the reason you find God is in order to bring God into this world. So he is never going to lose that balance after this Fourth and Walnut experience. Now, prophetic spirituality is going to do a number of things, but I made two main categories: to bear witness and to speak the truth. Now, the prophet bears witness. This starts with meeting God in silence. Now, he's going to develop that from the text in 1 Kings 19, where Elijah goes up to Mount Horeb. He's mad. He's feeling sorry for himself. The Jezebel's trying to kill him, and he's going back to Israel's foundational experience on top of Mount Sinai. Horeb is just another name for Sinai in the Old Testament. So when he's there, feeling sorry for himself, God comes to him. Now, in the Old Testament, when God comes, thunder, lightning, wind, storm, clouds, etc. Top of Mount Sinai, you have all of that. Ezekiel, when the fiery chariot comes from the heavenly realm, you have fire flashing out of it, etc. But the text says God is not found in the thunder and lightning. And then there's the wind, and so much so that the mountain is ripping apart, but God was not in the wind. And there was an earthquake, and God was not in the earthquake. God is in a small, still voice, a barely perceptible, voiceless voice. And that passage, in the text of Kings, emphasizes that God is present in his word, what he speaks to the prophet. But that passage is going to be used ever after by monastics to talk about contemplation, that God is to be found in silence, in that quiet, and that you have to be really quiet in order to hear that voice of God. And so if we're going to bear witness, we have to meet the God that we're going to bear witness to. So the biblical prophets met God in silence, but only Elijah, and then spoke God's word. So Merton thought the monk is to find God in silence, and that silence will foster communion and communication. Merton withdrew from the world to focus on his relationship with God, centered in contemplative prayer. But it was precisely his contemplative experiences that led him back into engagement with the world. He exemplified one who loved God and realized that a loving God means embracing the world that God so loved. And God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, John 3:16. But this encounter with God is supposed to lead to the transformation of the self. You need solitude to discover your true self. And in discovering your true self within, you will discover God. Now that means that when you begin to see yourself as God sees you, as you are known by God, when you discover who you truly are, then that is going to kind of have repercussions in life. And one of them is that you're going to value authenticity, that dishonesty, lack of integrity stuff is painful, that you experience your authentic self, and then you want out of that spirit of authenticity, you want the world to move towards authenticity as well. He believed in a radical commitment to authenticity. Now, in finding the true self, the prophet becomes selfless. The person becomes selfless. That you move from egocentric interests or ideological preservation. You now want to move out of that to meet, to minister to people prophetically in an authentic Christian spirit. So, we all have labels. If I say, "Who are you?" you might give me your name. Well, if you had a different name, would you be a different person? Probably. I always wanted the name Mary. My mother gave me Pauline. My confirmation name is Mary. I just like the name Mary. But I could dye my hair and still be me. I chose to be a biblical scholar, but if I had chosen to be an artist, I would still be me. Those are all things I have become, or that I have, and they have shaped me, but they're not my true self. The true self is who you are as loved by God. A prophet, then, who has this experience of God in solitude, an experience that has led to the transformation of the self, is one then who will live his or her life as a living witness to the providential action of God in this world. As the prophet is the one who sees God at work in this world. The prophet becomes a sign and witness for Christ, and so a sign and witness to the kingdom of God. As biblical prophets testify to the work of God in ancient Israel. And that was their task, to say what God was doing, what God was about. So the monk is to testify to Christ alive in this world. For Merton, the prophet is witness, not martyr. Now, there is going to be a period of time when prophets are seen as martyrs. They wrote a book entitled The Lives of the Prophets around 100 BC, which should really be titled The Death of the Prophets, because all it is one gory story after another of how these prophets met their doom. And you have that saying, no prophet is accepted in his own country, all emphasizing that the prophets met with martyrdom. But Merton says, no, the prophet is witness. He is witness to God's mercy, to God's divine mercy. And so the prophet is steeped in chesed over justice. And chesed is often translated mercy. It means enduring love, steadfast love. That God is one who bears steadfast love towards humanity, and you are then to bear steadfast love towards God and humanity. Now, this experience of God, this transformation of the self, leads to transformation of the world as far as Merton is concerned. Action is necessary to give expression to one's union with God in the love of one's neighbor. Remember the two basic commandments, love God and love your neighbor. So prophets have discovered their true self, and they are going to speak truth, but not out of hatred for the world, but out of love for the world. The prophet will expose the illusory social and personal structures of consciousness in order to transform the world. And Merton himself became very critical of the world. He saw that its values were superficial, that it was dehumanizing and unjust, that it was absorbed in consumerism and materialism, that there was a pervasive kind of godlessness, and that it was self-destructive, and that self-destruction expressed in war, in racism, and in dishonesty in business and politics. It sounds like today. So Merton's voice became a prophetic voice, calling for sense and justice in a most senseless and unjust century. But prophetic spirituality, it does have this negative, critical side to it. But more importantly, it is a positive response. It brings a positive response to the troubled world. The prophet is meant to be peacemaker, to bring reconciliation, to make the world face its truth, but not to punish it or harangue it or make it feel guilty, etc. It is to expose its truth in order to correct it, in order to bring about reconciliation. And from Gandhi, Merton will see the way to do this is through nonviolence. Now, Merton recognizes that a person who stands up and criticizes is going to be in deep doo-doo, that they're going to experience persecution, at the very least misunderstanding, they may be berated, etc. So he speaks of the necessity of an enduring faith. And it's a faith that continues even in the face of persecution. It's not easy to transform, to become transformed. On every little centimeter forward, it's 5 centimeters back. We want God to correct this fault and that fault, but I'll keep this one for a while, sort of thing. So it's not easy, and it demands a real strong commitment and endurance that you will stick with it. So to transform self and community is in some ways a Herculean task. The other thing that a prophet does is speak the truth. Now, here, Merton balances the sapienzo with the prophetic, the wisdom with the role of the prophet, the wise person who gains knowledge the prophetic person witnesses to truth, the witnesses to God and speaks the truth. So wisdom tells us how creation already manifests God. If you read the wisdom text of the Old Testament, they spend a fair amount of time on creation, and that wisdom has a role in creation. And if you want to become wise, you have to study creation. But prophecy, it calls attention to the gaps between the world as it was designed by God and the human realization of our failures and our brokenness. So that there is a discrepancy between the order that was established by God and how humanity has corrupted that order. Without prophecy, wisdom might tend to overlook problems and contradictions in the concrete human situation because it sees the global, the creation as a whole. So wisdom needs prophecy. But if prophecy is not grounded in wisdom, it can become little more than shrill, harsh, self-righteous. It could degenerate into the kind of frenetic activity of the activist, which can destroy the fruitfulness of their own works because it kills the wisdom that should ground everything and make one's work fruitful. The prophet is the one who communicates the truth of what God has revealed, no matter the cost, in order to help reconcile the world to God. It is the prophet who clearly sees the sickness of the age and speaks the truth. But he or she does so in order to promote liberation from illusion and to enable oneself and others to live a more authentic and meaningful life. And let me say in conclusion, I'm going to stop talking shortly. As the prophets of the Hebrew Bible raised a critical voice, so too Merton sees the importance of raising a critical voice today. As the prophets of old were grounded in the experience of God, so too does the voice of today's prophets need to be grounded in the experience of God. In the hope of reconciling the world to God, the prophets of old spoke the truth in spite of the persecution they endured. So too do those who adopt a prophetic spirituality speak the truth in the face of persecution for the sake of the salvation of the world. The way to do this for Merton is nonviolently. Gandhi's active nonviolence and his identification with the poor and the oppressed gave Merton a way to live prophetically, resisting the injustices of racism and the wars of his age. Let me conclude. That's I'm already in my conclusion. Self-conclude. Walter Brueggemann wrote a wonderful book that I recommend highly, The Prophetic Imagination. Walter Brueggemann is an Old Testament scholar. And when he talks about the prophets, Brueggemann says that the prophets are to criticize, to energize, and to do so eloquently. Okay, prophets are poets, okay, so do so eloquently. Prophets, they criticize. They see what is rotten at the core of modern society, which will lead to its destruction. It's what most people don't see. Okay, when Amos was announcing the doom of Israel, it was because he saw that the manner in which they were treating the poor of the land, the way they were exploiting the poor of the land, the way they were disenfranchising the poor from their own property, that was unacceptable and going to lead to the destruction of this country. Most people at the time of Amos were just delighted that the stock market was up and everybody in the upper echelon was feeling good. But they didn't see what was happening. Amos says, you do not see the ruin of Joseph. You don't see what's happening to the poor in the land. But prophets don't just criticize. They also energize. And that is, once the destruction has come, The prophets are going, behold, the days are coming. The mountains will drip sweet wine. The land will be fertile. I mean, it's these beautiful statements that, God himself will lead you back to Israel. So you have these expressions of hope. When everybody sees doom and destruction and everything's falling apart, the prophet is able to point them to the seeds of hope which are buried deep within, and so prepare for a hopeful future. I think Merton's prophetic spirituality is relevant for the non-monk. We are to speak the truth about the human condition, about our society, about the world and its values. So we must criticize. But we also bear witness to the presence of God in our troubled world, and so we are called upon to energize. Hopefully, the Spirit will also enable us to do so with an eloquence that speaks to the heart, to lead others, to love God, and to love neighbor, and so bring the kingdom of God into our world. Thank you. Okay, do you have any other questions, comments, issues, concerns?
I'm wondering about these categories, the major subcategories on this prophetic spirituality. For example, his East Asian studies and the intensity he seemed to feel about the importance of Asian religions vis-a-vis Christianity. And I guess I'm wondering why that's not included. I mean, I know it came very late in his life.
Well, I mean, you sort of have to ask the guy who wrote this book, but off the top of my head, it's probably because he didn't speak much about prophecy in them.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, that would be my guess. He does. He gets into he studies writers. The part one of the book is the writer as prophet, and there it's Blake, and then these Latin American poets, and then Merton wrote a book entitled an essay, Message to Poets, and he summarizes that too. And then he looks at Pastoret, Camus, and Faulkner. But then the part two is the existentialist as prophet, and that's where he picks up the existentialist. But I studied existentialism in college. I didn't realize there was so much controversy surrounding existentialism. But Jean-Paul Sartre and all the others, they were all atheists, and so when he begins to discuss existentialism, he gets highly Merton got it criticized for it because they were considered atheists, and so he writes an essay sort of defending that even atheists can speak to us, and that's where he draws on what I laid out on that thing. But then the last part of the book was the contemplative as prophet, and there Arsaman draws mainly from an article that he wrote on the contemplative prophetic vocation. But part of him writing that was because he was involved in discussions on the renewal of monasticism. One thing I left out here too, there are a few things I left out as I went along, but he wrote to some contemplative nuns, and there's some things that become part of his prophetic spirituality that's in that document. But what's interesting about that document is he talks about the status of women in the church, and that they've been overlooked, that the church doesn't give them enough credit and stuff. So he it was interesting. I didn't realize he had that feminist tinge to him that you see, at least in that document. You know, some things it would have been nice to have his voice with respect to the feminist movement. We just didn't because he died, you know, in '68. So,
What was he doing
what was he doing where?
in Bangkok?
Well,
How is that
Merton-
relate to-
Merton always had, you know, once he published The Seven-Story Mountain and became really popular, because, you know, it was on the national bestseller list for years, etc. He was constantly getting all of these invitations to speak. And the abbot was adamant that he was not going to do any of that. The abbot's a very interesting guy because he thought Merton was crazy. I mean, he thought he was mentally unstable. And that was one of the reasons he was so hard on him, or you know, kept him on such a short leash.
He didn't want him out in the public.
But the other thing that was funny though is, though this abbot, you know, he did think Merton was crazy. Merton was his confessor. You know, if I thought some spiritual person was crazy as a loon, I'm not sure I would go to them for confession. So I mean, it was I thought that was just sort of amazingly odd. But and what people don't seem to realize is that Pope Paul VI, he wrote to all the monasteries and he said, look into Eastern monasticism to see if they are doing anything that we are not doing in the West, in Western monasticism. And so Merton started reading on Eastern thought, Eastern monasticism, etc. For which, by the way, he got roundly criticized. But he was just doing what the Pope said to do. Then the abbot that was so hard on him retired. And this abbot he sent Merton to a psychiatrist because Merton wanted to be a hermit. And the psychiatrist told the abbot, he says, Merton wants to be a hermit located in the middle of New York's Times Square with a neon sign overhead going, hermit here, hermit here. And I mean, in some ways I think he was right. I mean, that's the way, Merton is just this mass of contradictions. You're only supposed to write 4 letters a year in the monastery to your family. But the monastery has a rule that if you're working on a project and you need to get advice from experts, you can write them. Merton wrote everybody. I mean, he was writing Pasternak, he carried on conversation with Polish philosophers, he's writing, I mean, he was writing everybody in the world. And then he complained that he had so much correspondence. What's nice is these people saved all their letters, which are now being published. But so that monk, that abbot resigned, or retired, and actually became a hermit, which he kept forbidding. He did eventually allow Merton to be a hermit. But then the new abbot came in, and now we have post-Vatican II, and religious communities were undergoing all of this upheaval and everything, and the monastery became more relaxed about allowing people to go elsewhere. So he had been asked to, they were having a conference on monasticism in the East, and he was asked to go, and the abbot gave him permission. And so that's why he was there. But while he was there, of course, he went a number of different places around there. He met with the Dalai Lama. It's just that he died in Bangkok right after he had given a talk in the morning, and he died in the afternoon. Oh, and one other thing. He wrote a letter to the monastery that they got after he died. He sent it from the East. And he said, I've come all this way to study Eastern monasticism to see what is lacking in Western monasticism, but they don't do anything we don't do. Oh, Okay.
I was just wondering if you'd ever heard that the CIA was following him. He was,
Yeah, I think they had a file on him, but they had a file on almost everybody. The thing is that Merton, when you read his journals, you find out that he was attracted to the Communist Party, and of course, you know, the 50s was McCarthyism and stuff, and they were all hyper about the communists. Today we're not hyper about Russia, and we should be, but they were not hyper. They were hyper. So he went to a communist meeting as a student, but he didn't like him at all. He never went again. So, but he was anti-Vietnam War. One of the best things in his journal is the abbot called him in. He's no longer allowed to publish on peace. Because he was very anti-Vietnam War. And he writes in his journal, I can't publish on peace. I'm a monk. I can write on war, but I cannot write on peace. And I mean, you could just hear him raging in this thing that he wrote. But in true Merton style, the abbot said you cannot publish him on peace. He didn't say you can't write on peace. So Merton wrote a thing, sent it to his friend, who duplicated it 1,000 times on a ditto machine, okay, not published, came out on a ditto machine, and sent it around. One of the people it was sent to was Pope John the 23rd. And they have studied what, they've published now that document, but they compared Merton's document to Pacem in Terris, and the Pope lifted a few phrases from that, nuanced his talk with stuff. So it did have influence, but he obeyed the letter of the law. He didn't publish anything.
Elijah heard God's voice in the silence, but not in the thunder, not in the wind,
Right.
not in the rain. Does that mean that hearing God in those other natural phenomena is now obsolete?
No. I taught at a Jesuit university for 35 years, well, 40 years, because I taught 5 years at St. Louis U, and we find God in all things. so it's not, you know, from Christianity's standpoint, we can even find God on the cross. You know, in the whole crucifixion thing, God is present. So you know, because some theologians speak of because God came into this world in Christ, then everything in this world becomes sacred, becomes a place where God can be found. And so no, that's the what's interesting in the Elijah text is that God is not found in the usual sort of way, that their usual expectation. He's found in this quiet voice. And, you know, there's going to be a real change in prophecy between the time of Elijah and Elisha and then later on Amos. With Elijah and Elisha, we have stories about the prophets contained in the book of Kings. We don't have a book of Elijah. We don't have a book of Elisha. And whatever prophetic word they speak is part of the story. But as soon as you get to Amos, it's all the prophetic word. You find out virtually nothing about Amos's life. It's just not important. And with Hosea, the only reason you find out anything about Hosea's life is because his marriage to an unfaithful woman is analogous to God's marriage to an unfaithful people. And so it becomes a metaphor for what God is feeling in the betrayal by his people. Isaiah Everything we know about Isaiah is a guess. We have the one story of his call in the temple, that's it. We know more about Jeremiah, but Jeremiah lives his message. And consequently, he lives a miserable life, but he lives his message. So, the thing that I think is important and why I talk so much about, that you have to kind of be grounded in solitude, that you have to spend quiet time. And I mean, it's not just because, I've been involved in centering prayer, but we are so rushed in our society, and we're so moving from one thing to another that we're not taking any time to absorb anything and to really think about things. Twitter becomes representative of our society. You can't think beyond 144 characters. In the theology department at Loyola, we got a Twitter account. And so we're discussing, well, what theological truth can we reduce to 144 characters? We decided Jesus loves you. But what it makes is if you read Merton's criticisms of American life, the consumerism, the materialism, and stuff like this, we've gone much further from his time. And the kind of superficiality that just is kind of pervasive in our society is alarming to me. We need deep thinkers, and we need people who reflect upon their own lives, reflect upon what they read and stuff, and that takes time and quiet.
That was really my question, because in modern day, the technology has certainly changed our lives. Communication, Twitter, internet, etc., etc. And he lived at a time when science was changing greatly. A lot of
technology was not anywhere near what it is today.
But the basic research was growing extensively. Did he ever comment on that or write about that?
At the Merton conference a few years ago, there was a paper on Merton and technology. And he does have some very, very negative things to say about technology because he felt that it was dehumanizing. But the speaker was trying to say that would he be that negative today? And is he just negative? Does he have a point, or is he just being kind of?
Well, I like to say the abuse of technology is very negative. But
I think so too.
Itself is really pretty good in many ways.
Pauline,
The thing is, as I understand history, studying.
a direct comment on what he was saying.
Yeah. Okay.
In one of the conferences with the novices, and I heard this a long time ago, in one of the recordings, he said to the novices, now this computer is equal to the discovery of fire. It is going to so change the world, it's going to have the power of fire. So,
Yeah, that's part of what I was going to say. As I look back at human history, we discovered fire. That was a great advance for humans. But it also burned the hell out of a lot of people. I mean, it was very destructive. And the same electricity, it's great. But I just wish I could get my house dark at night. I have a street light right outside my window, and no matter how heavy my curtain is, I still see the damn light through it, sort of thing. So there's an upside and a downside to everything. You can use discoveries for great good, but they can also be used for great harm. And that's where I think the prophet is needed, is to see kind of to warn against the use of these things in a negative way. So, you know, it's good and bad. I like the opening of The Tale of Two Cities. It is the best of times, it is the worst of times. And the thing is that when I am in despair over, you know, what's going on in our world today, which I thought we sort of settled in the 60s. God, it seems like bliss in the past. But to recognize that it's not all bad. There are beautiful things going on today. You know, some of the students would cause me to pull out my hair, but some of the students gave me great hope for the future generations. So, you know, it's the same always. You know, sometimes my family, for some reason they like to put down teachers. Many of them are lawyers, but you know, there are good teachers, there are bad teachers, and there are a lot of mediocre teachers. There are good lawyers, there are bad lawyers, there are a lot of mediocre lawyers. There are good doctors, bad doctors, and a lot of mediocre doctors. It's not as if one profession has some kind of privileged stance where everybody in that profession is great. Yeah, there's some good monks, some bad monks, and a lot of mediocre monks. I mean, that's just the way the world is. You know, what you want to do is to try to dull the damage done by the bad ones and highlight the good done by the good ones so that we can move forward. But
I just have a comment, which is like, maybe that's where contemplation comes in the sense of using technology for good. People have the time to like think about what they're doing before they do it. You know what I'm saying? It's like you need both or something instead of just being bound up by technology or something. And I guess I wanted to ask you if you thought that contemplation is kind of spreading, or meditation, because I've heard like they're using it in schools for kids now at the beginning of the day because it just helps them settle in if they had a rough day with their, you know.
well, it is, and there are a number of different reasons why that can be happening. One is, you know, most people in the West didn't know anything about Eastern thought until the end of the 1800s. You know, when they had that World Parliament of Religion here in Chicago, and they, what was his name? Susako brought Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. You know, so you know, we've only known about that. Now, what the East calls meditation, the West calls contemplation, sort of thing. But so I think in part it's been our contact with Eastern thought. But in addition, Merton wrote a book entitled Contemplation in a World of Action. And in that book, he is very adamant that the monks have something to teach the world, okay, to pray. But, you know, it's prayer in this world. It's not to make little monklets out of everybody around. You know, it's to learn to pray, and that's what monks are supposed to be experts at, praying, sort of thing. So I think that book was very influential in a number of different ways. And then the centering prayer movement grows out of a statement that Merton made about being centered in God. And so people like Father Keating, and then Pennington, and who's the one that begins with him? Menninger. Father Menninger. They all began centering prayer, and now they have contemplative outreach incorporated. You know, one time I said to Cardinal George, I said, look, if I want to do Eastern meditation, I can open up the Yellow Pages and find any meditation centers in the world, you know, in my neighborhood. But if I want to pray, where do I go? The priest is too busy, or the priest doesn't pray. I mean, one or the other. But where do I learn how to pray? And you know, he gave me one of, oh my God, what's she asking me again? Questions. I was always exasperating him. But shortly after I raised that question, I just stumbled onto Contemplative Outreach Incorporated and got involved with the Centering Prayer movement. Now, in Centering Prayer, it's an amazing experience to be in a huge room in a hotel, one of the big meeting rooms, ballrooms or something, with 1,000 people, and total silence for 20 minutes of Centering Prayer. I mean, it was just an amazing experience. It's like there was electricity in the room or something, and everybody was silent. I mean, nobody was whispering to one another. They were all silent. So, that 1,000 people would come to a meeting on prayer. Yeah, it's moving. There's the new monasticism, which are lay people who affiliate with a local monastery, and they try to live the spirituality of that monastery, sort of thing. So yeah, I do think people are more hungry for that because it's so absent, and sort of thing. So, Vatican II did something that had never been done before in the church. It published a document on the laity. Cardinal Newman said that one thing you can say about the laity is the church would look pretty funny without them. And they never really paid attention. And most lay spiritualities were just monastic spiritualities. But now they're trying to say, no, if indeed we are called to holiness by virtue of our baptism, then we have a responsibility as lay people to pray. We have a responsibility to live out our baptism by gaining knowledge of our faith and by practicing it. Somebody did send me a document that was being prepared talking about lay spirituality, but spirituality of married life. I mean, that's got to be a topic that is in bad need of reflection. When I was a kid and the nuns gave us these books on marriage, it was when you set the table, you put the plate here and then the glass here and something here to replicate the Trinitarian aspect. My mother had 7 kids. There's no way she was going to have time to set up a Trinitarian pattern on the table, sort of. Or Mary genuflected before she lifted Jesus from the bassinet. It was all this kind of piety that just was rendered obsolete with Vatican II. And so now we're kind of, fishing around to find things. So what are we doing? We're studying a monk in order to learn how to see what we can draw from his wisdom for our lives as lay people. And spending time in prayer, I think, is important. I might as well mention it. I've become an Ignatian associate. And these are lay people who are trying to live Jesuit spirituality in lay life. And the thing that I like about Jesuit spirituality is it's just basic common sense. How do you decide what God wants you to do? Well, what are you good at? Figure out how, what best serves you as well as what best develops you as well as serves others.
So then would you call the various third orders, would that be an example of lay monasticism?
But they're not, the third order of St. Francis and the Oblate, the Benedictines do have monks, etc. So but the new monasticism, they, as I said, they affiliate with a monastery, a local monastery, but they,
a local monastery.
Yeah, I mean, if you Google new monasticism, you'll find a whole lot about it, but those orders are like that. They're trying to, but the nuns I had in college, they have and associates attached to them, but that they're not a monastic community, sort of thing, though. But, you know, people are searching, and we're just, you know, searching, right? And that means we're going to make some mistakes, and you know, hopefully someone with great insight and the ability to communicate will be able to disseminate things that work for people. That's what you want, is something that works for people. I like the Taizé prayer because it's very meditative and it's very reflective, especially at Ascension in Oak Park, which draws about 400 or 500 people. But whether something like that would have a wide appeal, you know, is debatable. One of the things about the students at the university is that more of them are active in social outreach programs, working with the homeless or feeding the poor, etc., than ever was the case when I was in college and stuff. And that's a good thing to see. The youth are very action-oriented. What we need to get the youth to do is to sit and reflect and pray. But that's youth. I mean, it's easier to pray when you're in your 70s.
How would you assess?
But if you fall asleep during prayer, that just means you're praying at a deeper level.
How would you assess Merton's image or reputation among contemporary Catholics in the contemporary church?
Well, the thing is that contemporary Catholics, apart from people our age, don't know Merton. At the university, we have this Center for Catholic Intellectual Heritage, and they decided to do a book discussion. And so one semester they did Thomas Merton, and the next semester they did Dorothy Day, and the students had no idea who they were. You know, I was trying to introduce to the next generation, you know, famous Catholics from the past. What was it, when the Pope mentioned Merton in his speech in Congress, you know, my phone started lighting up. People were, did you see the Pope mentioned Merton? That was such a shock. The thing is, I think, now, you know, don't quote me, don't report me to the bishop. But I think by and large, our bishops have been sidetracked in terms of what is important. And they decided to take Merton out of the Catholics to be acknowledged book. I've never seen the book before, but I never heard of the book before they took Merton out of it. But it was the Catholics to be held up for imitation. And I think they pulled him out for a couple of reasons. One was that little affair with that woman that he had late in his life. I thought that the bishops, they may have been hopeful that that had happened to them, but it didn't. It happened to them. And so they dropped Merton. But it was also the Vietnam War and the social justice, the civil rights thing, because he was very active in those movements, giving his name to support certain things and stuff like that. And it was causing controversy at the time, but you know, Martin Luther was marching with nuns and priests, and they were causing the church great pain, sort of thing. But then what happened, within 20 years, we got Reagan as president, and then we got these bishops that are just to the right of Attila the Hun. And the whole abortion issue sort of thing, which just polarized them to the right, and they just couldn't see beyond that issue. And, you know, Merton making waves about civil rights and war, they just decided, you know, he's too far left for us. And, you know, they were fine with Merton as long as he was the monk in the monastery writing Seven-Story Mountains. But this, you know, after his book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, that was harder for them than, he was making waves and people were complaining. And I think that they, you know, who have we had in charge of the Bishops' Conference over the past 10, 15 years? Bishops who who are aligning themselves with the political right. Now, with Pope Francis, this is beginning to break down somewhat. But we just all want to pray for the health of Pope Francis, that he lasts a good long time, because to change the momentum that was created by these really arch right-wing conservative bishops. The thing is, my brother, he used to go down to Gethsemane every year, praising Merton, talk to Merton and stuff. Well, then Merton opposed the Vietnam War, and my brother was just incensed, and he was out there marching and stuff, and he was, he was promoting the civil rights movement, and my brother was just incensed, and he stopped going to Gethsemane. He's still just to the right of Attila the Hun. But it was that shift in mentality that I think did Merton in. And then his flirting with the East and stuff, they act like this was the worst thing in the world to do. When Merton died, they had all those rumors that the Vatican did him in because of that affair he had with that woman. It's for those reasons I think he's too liberal for them. They like the early Merton, they don't like the late Merton. I like the late Merton. And as a kid, I liked the early Merton. I read Seeds of Contemplation when I was 10 years old. And I did not understand a word I read. And then I read it about 10 years ago, and I still didn't understand a word I said. Somebody else had their hand.
I got a question.
Sure.
I have a grandma, and my youngest ones are 2 boys in first and second grade. And for prayer, I tell them whatever words you want to use, you can say Our Father or Hail Mary, but tell God what's on your mind. And then the next part of it is, now you listen. What is God telling you? It's a respect for even a young child can have a relationship in grace with the Creator. And this works. It works for kids just to have
children are more acceptable of the unseen dimension of reality. We get too sophisticated as we get older. Yeah. My niece's daughter, she was at Mass. She was 3 years old, and the crucifix was up front. My niece says, that's Jesus there. And my niece says, you know what Jesus is doing here? And the 3-year-old said, he's getting ready to fly. That's great, isn't it?
Pauline, it was a great talk, but I especially liked your ending that you read, and I just wonder, I'm not pushing you to close, but it would make a wonderful closing if you reread what you did at the end of your talk.
What did I do again?
It was something. I'm not sure what it was.
We do have to end because I have to go lecture on this. The one about the monastic spirituality is relevant for the non-monk?
Yes. Whatever you
Are we ready for a closer? Because it's after 4. The Spirit is given to all Christians, and as such we are called to speak the truth, that is criticize, be critical of the human condition, about our society, about the world and its values. But we are also to bear witness, that is to energize, but by bearing witness to the presence of God in our troubled world. And hopefully the Spirit will enable us to do so with an eloquence that speaks to the heart, to lead others to love God and to love neighbor, and so bring the kingdom of God into our world.